Imagine you pour every last coin you have into one idea. Your savings, your inheritance, the money you'd set aside for your kids. Now imagine your neighbor does the same, and their neighbor, and the baker down the street, and the widow 3 doors down. Now imagine the entire country does it. Every farmer, every merchant, every lord, every broke fisherman on the coast, everyone throws their money into one single venture. One ship, one dream, one bet, and it fails. Not quietly, not slowly. It fails so hard and so fast that within 2 years, your country literally ceases to exist as an independent nation. That's not a hypothetical. That happened. That's Scotland. And the man behind it? He'd already proven he was a financial genius. He'd helped build the Bank of England, an institution that's still standing today. He wasn't some con artist in a back alley. He was the real deal. And he still managed to destroy an entire country. His name was William Paterson. You've probably never heard of him. Almost nobody has. And honestly, that's kind of the point. Because the people who break things on this scale tend to get forgotten. It's more comfortable that way. Okay, so let me back up. Because there's a version of Scottish history that gets taught in schools and it's garbage. Not completely false, just scrubbed clean. The story goes like this. In 1707, Scotland and England decided to merge. 2 countries came together, formed Great Britain, everyone shook hands, moved forward, built an empire. Very tidy, very civilized. Makes it sound like a marriage between equals. But here's what that version leaves out. Scotland didn't agree to the union because it wanted to. Scotland agreed because it was bankrupt. Flat broke, ruined. And the reason it was ruined, the specific, traceable, documented reason, was a failed colony in a swamp in Panama that killed thousands of Scottish settlers and evaporated something like 1/4 to half of all the money in the entire country. One scheme did that. One scheme changed the map of Europe forever. And almost nobody talks about it. So who was William Paterson? He was born around 1658, somewhere in the Scottish lowlands. Dumfriesshire probably, though honestly, even that's debated. What isn't debated is that the guy was sharp, seriously sharp. He'd traveled as a young man, spent time in the Caribbean, watched the shipping routes, saw firsthand how the Spanish and the Dutch and the English were getting filthy, rich-moving goods across oceans. And he understood something that a lot of clever people understood at the time, but very few could actually act on. The future belonged to whoever controlled trade. Not land, not armies. Trade money moving across water. That was the game, and Paterson wanted Scotland in it. But before Scotland, he did something else. Something most people don't connect to this story at all. In 1694, William Paterson was one of the key figures behind the creation of the Bank of England. The Bank of England, one of the most powerful financial institutions in human history. The blueprint for modern central banking. Paterson helped design it. He understood how credit worked, how you could essentially create money from trust, how a government could borrow against future tax revenue to fund wars and expansion right now. This wasn't a dreamer with no track record. This was a man who'd already reshaped how an entire nation handled money. Keep that in mind as the story unfolds, because it makes everything that comes next so much worse. Now, from what historians can piece together, Paterson got pushed out of the Bank of England pretty quickly. Politics got egos, other directors who didn't want to share power. Whatever the reason, by the mid-1690s, Paterson was done with England and looking north. Back home. And Scotland in the 1690s was hurting. I mean, really hurting. England was booming. The East India Company was basically a money printer. Colonial trade was exploding. London was getting rich. And Scotland? Locked out. England had these things called the Navigation Acts, trade laws that essentially said all colonial commerce had to flow through English ships and English ports. If you were Scottish and you wanted a piece of the global trade boom, tough luck. Go through England or go home. Scotland was watching the biggest economic expansion in history happen right next door and couldn't touch it. That kind of frustration does things to a nation. It makes people desperate. It makes them reckless. And it makes them very, very susceptible to a big idea from a charismatic man. Paterson had the idea, the Isthmus of Panama, Darien. This narrow strip of land where North America meets South America. His pitch was actually kind of brilliant if you don't think about it too hard. Set up a Scottish colony right on the isthmus. Control the land bridge between the Atlantic and the Pacific. Every ship carrying goods between Europe and Asia, instead of sailing all the way around the bottom of South America, months of dangerous open ocean, could stop at your colony, unload cargo on one coast, move it overland, reload on the other coast. You become the middleman of the entire world, the gatekeeper. Think of the Panama Canal today, and you get the idea, except Paterson was imagining this 2 centuries before the canal existed. On paper, it looked harmless. On paper, it looked genius. Scotland would leapfrog England overnight. So in 1695, the Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies was established. Big name, big ambitions. The plan was to raise capital from investors all over Europe. English money came in at first. Dutch money showed interest. But then, and this is the hinge moment, this is where the entire thing pivots, England killed it. King William III, who wore both the English and Scottish crowns, decided that a Scottish colony in Panama would provoke Spain. And provoking Spain meant war, and war was expensive. Plus, the East India Company, which was basically running English foreign policy at this point, lobbied furiously against any Scottish competition. So English investors got leaned on, pulled out. Dutch investors got warned. Hamburg merchants, who'd already committed, were threatened until they backed off. Every single external source of funding dried up. Not naturally, deliberately. England choked off Scotland's access to international capital on purpose. And this is where a sane country would have paused. Would have said, okay, the money isn't there, let's scale back, rethink, maybe try something smaller. But Scotland didn't do that. Scotland did the opposite. The Company of Scotland turned inward. It went directly to the Scottish people and said, fund this yourselves. Be your own investors. Build your own empire with your own money. And that message hit Scotland like a drug. It wasn't just an investment opportunity anymore. It was a cause, a matter of pride. Scotland against the world. Scotland proving it didn't need England's permission to succeed. Nobles put in money. Merchants mortgaged their businesses. Farmers scraped together everything they had. Widows invested. Many records suggest that between a quarter and half of all the liquid money circulating in Scotland ended up in this one company. One company, one venture. Everything. No diversification. No safety net. Just blind, all-consuming national pride dressed up as a business plan. 5 ships left the port of Leith in July 1698. Around 1,200 settlers aboard. And I want you to pay attention to what they packed, because it tells you everything about how badly this was planned. They brought combs, mirrors, wigs, and woolen cloth. They were sailing to a tropical jungle, one of the most humid, suffocating landscapes on the planet, and they packed wool. That alone should have been a red flag the size of Edinburgh Castle. But nobody was thinking clearly. The dream was too loud. They arrived at Darien in November 1698, and it was a disaster almost immediately. The land was swamp, dense hostile jungle pressing in from every side. Mosquitoes everywhere, and with them malaria, yellow fever, dysentery. Men started dying within weeks. The soil was terrible for farming. The indigenous people nearby were friendly enough at first, but couldn't feed 1,200 extra mouths. And those trading goods they'd brought, the combs, the wigs, the wool, worthless. Nobody in Central America wanted any of it. There was nothing to trade, nothing to eat, and no way to make money. The entire economic premise of the colony collapsed on contact with reality. But here's the part that really burns. They asked for help. The Scottish settlers sent messages to English colonies nearby, Jamaica, Barbados, begged for supplies. And the English governors said no, turned them away. Not because they couldn't help, because they'd been ordered not to. King William had explicitly instructed English colonial authorities to give the Scottish settlers nothing. No food, no medicine, no trade, nothing. Think about that for a minute. These were fellow subjects of the same king, dying in a jungle. And the crown told its own people to let them die because helping Scotland succeed was not in England's interest. That's not politics. That's something colder than politics. By June 1699, less than 8 months after landing, the surviving settlers abandoned the colony. Of the roughly 1,200 who left Scotland, a horrifying number never came home. Estimates vary, but we're talking hundreds dead. Disease mostly, starvation. Despair, Paterson himself was on that expedition. His wife died there, he barely survived. Came back to Scotland a wreck. Sick, broken, hollow. If this kind of story interests you, how money and power actually drive history behind the scenes, do me a favor and hit subscribe. It takes a second, I appreciate it. Now let me tell you why Darien going badly wasn't even the worst part. Here's the worst part. While the first expedition was collapsing, Scotland didn't know. That's how slow communication was in the 1690s. Before news of the disaster reached Edinburgh, a second fleet had already sailed. Another 1,300 settlers, heading straight for the same nightmare. They arrived and found the colony abandoned. Huts rotting, graves everywhere. And instead of turning around, which is what any sane person would do, they tried to rebuild. Because the money was already spent. Because national honor was at stake. Because turning back meant admitting it was all for nothing. So they stayed, and then the Spanish showed up. Spain had always claimed that territory, and they weren't about to let some broke Scottish settlers squat on it. The Spanish besieged the colony. The English still refused to help. Disease kept killing. By April 1700, the second group surrendered. Walked away with nothing, more dead. More ships lost, the dream was finished. And Scotland was destroyed. I don't use that word lightly. The money was gone, not some of it. Essentially all of it. The national wealth that had been poured into the Company of Scotland vanished. Into jungle mud, into the ocean, into Spanish hands. Lords who'd invested heavily were ruined. Merchants went bankrupt. And the ordinary people, the farmers and widows and small traders who'd put in their savings because they believed, because they trusted, because they wanted Scotland to matter, they lost everything. There was no insurance, no bailout, no safety net, just gone. And right on cue, right when Scotland was at its absolute lowest, England walked in with an offer. The Act of Union, 07. Let's merge, become one country. Great Britain, and we'll pay you. The equivalent, they called it, roughly £400,000. A chunk of that specifically earmarked to compensate Darien investors. England was offering to cover Scotland's losses. Generous, right? Except think about what Scotland was giving up in return. Its parliament, its independence, its sovereignty, its identity as a separate nation. 400 years of fighting English domination. Wallace, Bruce, Bannockburn, all of it traded away because the bank account was empty. Robert Burns wrote it plainly. We're bought and sold for English gold. Such a parcel of rogues in a nation. That's not poetry, that's an invoice. And you know who got most of that compensation money? Not the widows, not the farmers. The nobles, the politically connected, the big investors who had platforms and influence, the same class of people who'd promoted the scheme, hyped it up, convinced ordinary Scots to throw in their life savings. Those people got looked after. The little people got absorbed into a country they never voted for, governed by a parliament in London that didn't know their names. The pattern is so old it's almost boring. Almost. The powerful gamble with other people's money. When it works, they take the credit. When it fails, they get the bailout. And everyone else gets the bill. The thing that haunts me about this story is England's role. England didn't just stand aside while Darien failed. England helped it fail. The denial of assistance to dying settlers, the blocking of international investment, the diplomatic pressure to isolate Scotland financially, none of that was accidental. Many historians believe England wanted Darien to collapse because a broke Scotland was a Scotland that could be absorbed. The Union wasn't a rescue, it was a purchase. And the price had been set years in advance by deliberately making sure Scotland had no other options. You let someone drown and then sell them a life jacket. That's the template, and it works every single time. Paterson himself survived to see the Union happen. He even helped negotiate the financial terms, which is so ironic it almost hurts. The man whose scheme destroyed Scottish independence ended up helping draft the paperwork that formalized it. He died in 1719, mostly forgotten. No statues, no fanfare. Just a man who swung bigger than anyone in Scottish history and missed so badly that the shockwave lasted centuries. And here we are. 300 plus years later, and Scotland is still wrestling with this. The 2014 independence referendum, the Brexit fallout, the SNP pushing for another vote. Every time the conversation about Scottish independence comes back, and it always comes back, Darien is underneath it. Not always by name, but the wound is there. The question is always the same one it was in 1707. Can Scotland afford to stand alone? And buried inside that question, whether anyone admits it or not, is a memory. A memory of the last time Scotland bet on itself and lost everything. So the next time someone tells you the United Kingdom was founded on mutual respect, on shared values, on a willing partnership between equals, remember the jungle. Remember the wool they packed for Panama. Remember the English ships that sailed past dying Scots because helping them wasn't strategically convenient. Remember that a nation's freedom wasn't taken by an army. It was taken by a balance sheet. Scotland didn't lose a war. Scotland lost a bet. And 300 years later, it still hasn't gotten back to the table.